The mysterious case of D.B. Cooper remains the only unsolved case of aerial piracy on record. On November 24th, 1971, a lone man hijacked a passenger plane by claiming to have a bomb strapped to his person. He demanded a large sum of cash and access to 4 parachutes, enough for him and a member of the plane's staff to jump off. After landing long enough to allow the other passengers to disembark and for the plane to refuel, he demanded the plane reroute itself to Mexico. He jumped out using a parachute far before it ever reached the other country or even its refuel spot in Nevada. There are a multitude of theories regarding the identity of the culprit, but few focus on the most important details surrounding the crime. I have uncovered evidence that the perpetrator was an agent of the United States Central Intelligence Agency. Several key facts in the case point to this conclusion, from the specific plane chosen to commit the crime with, to the location of the flight chosen and the thief's familiarity with certain military outpostings in the area. All the details add up to a conclusion which fully explains the culprit's evasion of arrest and the government's inability to apprehend the fugitive. Let's start with the plane. The plane used in the hijacking, a Boeing 727, was a specific model used by the CIA to drop provisions and soldiers into Vietnam during the war covertly, a fact which was not known to the general public at the time of the crime. In fact, the exact mechanisms that allowed this particular plane to serve that function were a manufacturer's secret, which only high-ranking government officials and those in charge of the plane's engineering would know about. Select Air Force personnel may have also been aware of this feature, notably pilots. But Cooper's knowledge of the plane didn't line up with what would be expected of a pilot. In addition, the CIA often used civilian pilots to avoid suspicion as they engaged in these covert wartime operations. Another factor pointing to D.B. Cooper being a government operative in some capacity is the fact that he mentioned the nearby location of the McChord Air Force Base to a flight attendant, as well as its exact distance from their landing location. This wouldn't have been a piece of common knowledge to someone who just happened to live or work in the area of Washington, as the base was not of economic or social importance to most inhabitants of the region. His knowledge of the specifics surrounding the region were exclusively in relation to points of interest to the U.S. military and U.S. intelligence agencies. The parachutes provided by the plane's owner were also of a military style, and their method of use would have been unfamiliar to someone who engaged in parachuting only as a civilian hobby. In fact, the investigators who researched D.B. Cooper's disappearance concluded that any sport skydiver would have been unable to use these parachutes. Cooper was able to operate them without any assistance, not even needing the placard explaining how to use them. This implies he previously received training in the use of them, likely from the military, likely in Vietnam, during a mission using the civilian 727s the CIA had commandeered. Speaking of overseas service, that's likely where the culprit picked up the code name he used. While his alias was reported as D.B. Cooper by media outlets, a confusion with a known suspect by the FBI who lived in the area, the actual name he provided while he was on the flight was Dan Cooper, the name of a character in a European comic series who was a military pilot and secret agent. Say what you want about Mr. Cooper, he was nothing if not a man with a great sense of irony. The comics were published in France and Belgium, 2 nations with heavy CIA presence in the 1950s and 60s, the decades the hijacker likely would have been involved in the agency, as he was described as being in his mid-40s at the time of the hijacking in 1971. Now, 1971 isn't known as the peak of investigative forensics for law enforcement, but they did have some methods of determining the identity of a criminal based on crime scene evidence. Unfortunately, D.B. Cooper, as a former operative of the Deep State, was aware of these methods and took efforts to counteract them. He left nearly no physical evidence behind, not even letting the flight attendants take the matches he used to light his cigarettes and throw them away. He took them with him. Any fingerprints he left behind were only partially recoverable and generally not of good quality. In addition, the latter parts of the hijacking and the parachute jump took place on a dark night with heavy cloud cover, so that the military personnel tracking the flight from the jets following it were unable to make out the body falling and therefore unable to know the exact location or timing of the jump. In 1980, a child found some of the bills used to deliver the ransom D.B. Cooper demanded, washed up and degraded on the shore of a nearby river. Many suspected this meant that D.B. Cooper had died during the jump, but the truth is that a forensic specialist confirmed that the conditions of the bills could only have occurred if they were placed into the river several years after the initial hijacking. The money found years later was a plot to throw off the trail, an ingenious plot developed by Cooper or one of his government contacts. After all, if Cooper had merely left the money behind during his initial jump as he trekked to safety, the bills would have entered into circulation within nature far before the date provided by the forensic scientist as the earliest possible entry into the river system. In addition, the degradation was not consistent with what it would have been if they had been buried and recovered later or left exposed above ground. In conclusion, there is sufficient evidence to suspect that D.B. Cooper was an agent of the CIA, one who had worked in close correspondence with multiple Air Force pilots during the Vietnam War, and who now, for some reason unbeknownst to us, had motivations that propelled him to hijack a plane and demand a hefty ransom. Alright, so we've made it through the first part of the video there, guys, where I laid out all the facts and what my beliefs are. Do appreciate you sticking with us here. So the real reason that I got into this is that a friend of mine mentioned they'd watched a documentary and done their own research on D.B. Cooper and wanted me to look into this and provide what information I could. So I started doing the research, and there were several theories laid out as to the identity of D.B. Cooper, his motivations, several things like that. I'm not exactly sure I have a solid read on the motivations. He is reported both as former military personnel and as a Native American looking for vengeance. And some of the theories I've read online, both of those theories are well supported. But the one motivation that I had never seen explored before was the idea that this was secretly a government cover-up, which is something I think happens far more often than we think whenever there's any mysterious happenings going on in the world. And there's a lot of evidence. So in particular, a lot of the evidence was saying that he was an Air Force pilot, and that was how he was familiar with all this. But there was another group of individuals working for the U.S. government in Vietnam who also had access to the same type of information these Air Force pilots would have had. In addition, D.B. Cooper didn't seem familiar with the workings of the plane outside of the landing gear. So this pilot theory that's going around doesn't seem to make as much sense when you take that into account. But the CIA operative who was using these Boeing 727s as a method to drop supplies and personnel into very sparsely populated areas in Vietnam, it does seem as if that's much more likely to me, based on the evidence provided. In addition, there's been a lot of research into, how did he get away? How has no one found him? His body was never even found. Is he in the river? There was a lake nearby. They drug the lake, didn't find anything, never found the money or the landing gear either. So I'm thinking that there's a very good chance that they did find some of this, and the government decided to cover it up, either because he had worked on some classified projects that they didn't want getting out there. If they release his name and the fact that he was a former government employee, people who are open-minded and willing to consider things and do further digging, which pretty much everybody who's interested in this case falls under that category. They would dig deeper, and they might find some connection to some activities in Vietnam, in France, in Belgium, and other countries that the U.S. government would rather we not know about, possibly even tying into the murder of the President John F. Kennedy. There's a deep possibility, there's a real possibility that any individuals who were working for the Central Intelligence Agency during that 1950s, 1960s era may have knowledge or have been involved in some situations regarding the president. I think most people are aware that there's a little shady stuff going on there. So anybody who was a CIA agent around that time has, probably some connections or some knowledge or just some insight into that issue that the government was definitely looking to suppress, especially in the 1970s, the early 1970s, 1971, that it would have made sense for them to allow this man to steal $200,000 and get away with it. It's much less expensive to just toss that, get it to the side, let the insurance company take that hit, than it is to have these deep state secrets about the murder of John F. Kennedy or other operations internationally get out. So that's my opinion on the issue. I do hope you found this informative. Thank you for watching and listening. Please like and subscribe. I hope you have a wonderful day.